My name is Peter Gray. I'm a research professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College. I am kind of a biologist by background and training, and I look at human behavior from an evolutionary biological perspective. I have very long been studying children's development, looking at the basic needs that children have to develop well, to learn what they need to learn, to feel confident, to feel mentally healthy. I've been writing about that for a long time. I've been an advocate for self-directed education because my own research shows that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. Their curiosity, their playfulness, their desire to grow up, their desire to understand the people and the world around them. All of this is part of their nature, and we suppress it in our regular schools. And so I've become an advocate for allowing children to take charge of their own education and have done considerable research on that, showing that, believe it or not, it works. They become well educated, they go on to good lives.
Mm.
So that's
Yeah.
part of what I've been doing. I've also been working through the Let Grow organization to bring more play and freedom to children's lives, even if they're going to regular public schools. Working with schools and other organizations to try to create more opportunities for children to play freely, especially with other children without adult constraints and intervention and direction, which absolutely ruins play. So, so that's a brief introduction in which I've presented sort of all my biases right out front, and we can go from there.
That sounds great. Well, I highly approve of your biases. As sort of the leading scholar of play for lo these many years, I know you have a new book that's coming out soon that seems very pointed to the time that we're in right now. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that book and how it kind of culminates or fits in with the work you've been doing today.
So the book is going to be published September 15th. It's possible to pre-order it now. You can go to my website to find a way to do that. The title of the book is, the main title is Restoring Childhood. The subtitle is How to Let Kids Free in an Age of Anxiety. It is in some sense a counter book to the very popular book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. I'm admitting that our children are very anxious, but I have a very different explanation for it than his, or at least a rather different explanation for it than his. So the book really is about how over decades, really over the entire period of my life, which is about 8 decades, um, over that entire period, the evidence shows that children are getting more and more anxious with every decade, beginning really in the 1960s. The 1960s, they were more anxious than in the 1950s. 1970s, still more anxious. 1980s, still more anxious. 1990s, still more anxious. Interestingly, in the beginning in the 1990s into the 2010s, their anxiety declined somewhat.
Ah,
Its
ah.
rates of suicide among teenagers declined. So that's a puzzle. Why did that happen? And I have a chapter on that in the book. I believe I know why it happened. And then beginning around 2010, anxiety, depression, suicide increased again. And Jonathan Haidt has his explanation for that, which is that it's because of social media and smartphones. I have my explanation, which is because it's a change in how we do schooling.
Ah.
Common Core began in 2010, and everybody who's studied the effects of Common Core from an unbiased position has shown that it greatly increased the amount of anxiety generated by school.
Mm.
Everybody involved with school became more anxious. Principals, teachers, and students became more anxious because of the focus on test scores, the change in curriculum such that teachers had less freedom to modify what they were doing. They had to teach the common curriculum. And there's no question but what this greatly increased the amount of anxiety of children, school-age children. That's my explanation. And it also explains something that Jonathan Haidt's theory can't explain. Why did this great increase in anxiety, depression, and suicide occur in the United States, but not in Europe?
Mm,
In
mm,
Europe, they've
mm.
got smartphones. They're on social media just as much as our kids are, but they did not have the same change in schooling, with one exception. If you count England as Europe, as in Europe, they're not in the EU. But England also showed an increase, but they also showed a change in education similar to ours. And Sweden is the one country in the EU that also showed an increase, and they showed an educational change, same as ours. So part of my book is to explain why over all these decades, we've got first a rise in anxiety, depression, which I attribute to a decline in children's freedom to play, to explore, a gradual decline. We were chipping away at children's freedom through all that time. An increase in a decrease in anxiety, depression, which, and a lot of listeners are going to be surprised at this, which I attribute to the computer revolution. Suddenly, children had a new way to play. They could play online. Suddenly, they had a new way to communicate with their friends outside of adult monitoring and control. And they regenerated a kind of culture of childhood, which children need in order to feel confident, in order to learn to be resilient, in order to learn that they've got real friends in their own peer group, and so on. So I believe that that is what led to something of
Mm,
an increase for a period of time, and then the decrease, the decrease in mental health occurred again when schools changed. That's a
mm.
very brief overview of complicated arguments that are supported. Is if you get the book, be prepared to see literally hundreds of references to research studies, but I believe it's written in a very readable manner and you'll be able to follow it. But if you
Mm.
want to look at the documentation, it's all there.
I very much appreciate sort of the counter narrative to Haidt's work, which has really kind of taken hold in everything from screen time bans in schools across the country to increased anxiety among parents about what they're doing wrong, in terms of
Right.
raising kids. Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic period, which was a little bit of a weird bubble in some ways, in this otherwise sweep of history. One of the things that my work has showed was that during the pandemic, families became first exposed to self-directed education, homeschooling, virtual schooling, things that they may not have ever experienced before. And that a goodly number of them, many more than had before, decided to stick with that. How does the pandemic period look to you in the sweep of your research? And can you talk a little bit about long tail effects that you've seen on that in education and among really what families are looking for?
Well, first of all, I agree with what you just said. The number of people homeschooling greatly increased after the pandemic compared to before, and many of them are staying with it. Homeschooling is, in some sense, the gateway to self-directed education because parents might believe they're going to give the school curriculum at home. But it doesn't work. They realize that parents are bored by the school curriculum, let alone the kids. So they quickly kind of move towards paying attention to what the kids are interested in. Why should I be teaching dinosaurs because that's in the school curriculum if my child is interested in butterflies? It quickly moves to a more and more kind of self-direction, and some parents then go all the way and say, what we're doing is unschooling, self-directed education at home. So there was definitely an increase in sort of a quantum jump, really a doubling immediately in the number of homeschoolers. And a fair number of them really stayed with it. But there's definitely more homeschoolers now than there were before the pandemic. And the pandemic played a role in that. I think one of the things that happened with the pandemic, you had kids doing online learning, and their parents were supposed to be there monitoring it. And I think I heard from a lot of parents saying, oh my God, no wonder my kid is bored at school. And also, a lot of parents who felt incompetent about homeschooling realized that, I could do at least as good a job as that,
Right,
so
right.
it encouraged them to homeschool. So I agree with that. The Let Grow organization actually did a rather large scale study of families during the pandemic, which I wrote up and published as an article in the American Journal of Play, if people are interested. But what we did was to do surveys of families during the school closure period. So schools closed in the middle of March 2020, and we did one survey in the middle of April, 1 month after schools closed, and another 2 months after schools closed in the middle of May. Each survey was of 1,600 families, so this was a large study. 1,600 families who had children between the age of 8 and 13, so in that
Hmm.
middle childhood age range, demographically rather balanced across the country, across socioeconomic groups, across racial categories, and so on and so forth. For half the surveys, we asked the questions of the kids, and for the other half of the surveys, we asked the questions of the parents. And we repeated the survey in April and May with the same questions, but different 1,600 families each time.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
And so this was a big study. And so, for example, one of the questions we asked of the kids was, are you more anxious or less anxious now than you were before the school closure? The great majority said less anxious. And when we asked the parents, are your kids more anxious or less, they also said less anxious. When we asked the parents, are you more anxious or less anxious? The tendency was for the parents more to say, I am more anxious.
Right.
Not
Right.
surprisingly. They're the ones responsible for the family health, for all the problems that can go wrong. But another question, interestingly, that we asked the parents was, are you getting along better or worse with your kids now than you were before the school closure? The great majority said getting along better, which might have surprised a lot of people, but it didn't surprise me because every summer when schools close, parents find they're getting along better with their
Mm,
kids.
mm.
School is a big source of friction in the family. You've got to make the kids do their homework. You've got to get them up for school when they're not really ready to get up, and all these extracurricular activities, which were now closed down. You've got to get them to that stuff. It's a kind of a constant little battle between the parents and getting the kids to do all the things that the parents think the kids have to do, and the kids are reluctant to do. And so it's not surprising to me. And the other question we asked, which was an open-ended question, was which also had a yes or no. Has your view about your children changed in some
Mm,
way as a result of
mm.
this time? And if so, how? The great majority said it changed, and essentially all of them said it changed for the better.
For the better.
And
Yeah.
what they said they found is that their children are far more resourceful than they thought they would be. That here they were, all the normal activities closed down. They thought they were going to have to amuse their children would be bored, they wouldn't know what to do. And they found that after a little while, the children discovered things they wanted to do. They were reading books that they wanted to read instead of what was assigned to them by the school. They were playing games online with their friends, so they weren't really as socially isolated as people thought. They were riding bicycles. It was something they could do social distancing outdoors. Some parents said, I was amazed to discover that my son or my daughter wanted to learn how to cook meals. I was impressed that my
Mm.
older child, instead of bullying my younger child, was helping to take care of my younger child and amusing and playing with my younger child and being very kind to my younger child. One of the questions we asked to the children is an open-ended question. We asked them, what was the best thing about this time of school closure for you? The leading answer somewhat surprised me, but in retrospect, not. It was basically that one of them put it very extremely, said, I realized how much my parents loved me.
Oh,
Isn't
wow.
that touching?
Wow.
Because here we are, we're eating our meals together. They clearly care about me. We're spending family time together. We're getting to know one another. Others basically said that kind of thing, not quite in such tear-evoking language,
Mm,
but very clearly and interestingly, there were a couple of other studies using other methods of children during the pandemic which interestingly came to the same conclusion as ours. They found that using different measures, found that children were less anxious than they had been beforehand, including teenagers, less anxious. Everybody was predicting that they would be more
right.
anxious, but they weren't. They were less anxious. We also know, by the way, separately from that, that the suicide rate went down during that period for teens, and mental health hospitalization went down during that period, just like it goes down every summer when schools close. No surprise, really.
Mm.
And also, at least one of the studies asked the children, as we did, what did they like best, and they also said this sense of family togetherness, this
Mm.
sense that we are acting as a family in ways that we weren't doing before.
And so one of the things that's you hear from school folks anyway is that post-pandemic, when kids came back into school, anxiety and depression spiked like crazy. Does that do you have any way of knowing what's in that data? And if so, how would you sort of characterize that phenomenon?
I believe that the schools, as far as I can tell, the people reporting that it spiked higher than it had been before the pandemic, I believe that's exaggeration.
Okay.
I believe people wanted to blame things on the pandemic. Years later, they were still blaming lower academic scores on the pandemic. That was ridiculous. Just ridiculous. But they're blaming it. They wanted to blame all the problems of the school system on the pandemic. One of the studies was actually of suicide rates. Somebody who'd been tracking, group that had been tracking suicide rates, it showed cyclically every year suicide rates among teenagers go down in the spring when schools close. Go down their
Mm,
lowest in July and August, which are the 2 months when almost all schools are closed. They're
right,
about half the rate that they are during the school year, and then they go up when the school year begins. What these people found is during the pandemic in 2020, instead of waiting until mid-June and early July for it to go down, it went down beginning in March. It plummeted just the way it previously did. When schools opened again, it went back up to the same level that it was previously whenever schools opened. It did
wow,
not go
wow,
higher than when schools opened. It just went back to that same level. And
right,
other people tracking anxiety as reported by kids found basically the same thing. Mental health admissions went back to normal, to typical levels when you're in school, not higher than they
right,
were before the pandemic. You find some tiny little clinically non-significant effect of social media and it gets headlines in the
right.
media. Here's a huge effect of school, and you don't see it published in the newspapers and magazines.
Right.
I'm trying to correct that.
Yeah, and we appreciate that. So let me end by asking you to get out your crystal ball and look into the future. You've had a long, many decades of time to study patterns and so on. If you were to predict what all this is going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what makes you most optimistic about what's happening with education, families, and kids, and what makes you most concerned?
It's very hard to put a timeline on this, but let me describe trends that are already happening, which I think are positive trends. First of all, as we already talked about, more people are taking their children out of school. More people are doing homeschooling. More people within the homeschooling group, because there's more people doing it, are finding others doing it. And they're creating little micro schools, they're creating learning centers, they're creating settings for homeschoolers. Homeschooling is really a misnomer. It's as if ever all the learning occurs at home. Home is not an adequate place for learning. You need to be exposed to the larger world. You need to have friends who are not just your siblings and family. So I think with more and more so-called homeschoolers, they're finding others who are doing this. They're creating communities. They're finding ways of connecting their kids with other kids. They're developing all sorts of alternative educational systems so that there's increasingly a sort of free market, in, if you want to call
Mm.
it that, of opportunities available. Some states, and I must admit it's mostly the red states, are coming up with money to abet this. I'm all in favor of this, as long as
Hmm.
there's not too many strings attached as to what you have to do to get that money. But it's making it more and more possible for people with lower economic means to be able to find alternative routes for their children. I think this is all a very healthy development. I think that at this point, this is increasing. I think at some point it will reach a tipping point where there's enough people doing this kind of thing that it becomes seen as normal. It becomes seen as a normal alternative and will be seen as a less risky thing for parents to do. And they'll see more and more people doing this successfully. And at some point, the floodgates will open up, and everybody, and many, many people are going to leave the public schools. At that point, the schools are either going to have to reform dramatically in a way that frees children to be more self-directed, to use their own resources in school, to feel less like they're in prison, or the public schools are simply going to become dinosaurs. They're going to become extinct and
Hmm.
be replaced by something else. In one of my predictions about 10 years ago, not exactly a prediction, but more a hope, was that our public school system that we call our public school system would be replaced by another public system we have, which is the public library system.
Mm. Mm.
Libraries are designed to help people learn what they want to learn, right? And there are libraries in every community. The infrastructure is there. And if libraries expanded in such a way that they became recreation centers, they became daycare centers, they became places where children could play and explore and learn, that the library system could become the new public
Mm.
education system. There's some libraries already moving in that direction. So I have some hope about that. I think it could possibly happen. Library, the old function of libraries is less important now than before. The function of being a source, you'd go to the library to find information that you needed, but now you can find that information with a couple of thumb twitches on your
Right.
smartphone. So libraries don't have so much that function anymore. People don't buy books to the degree they did before, partly because books are so cheap these days and you can get a lot of them online free and so on and so forth. So you don't need to go to the library so much for the old purposes, but libraries, like any organization, want to remain relevant. So they are taking on new functions. And I actually also wrote an article for the American Journal of Play about this trend in libraries. More and more play at libraries, more and more libraries seeing themselves as community centers for all sorts of purposes. So I think that's a very positive trend. The other thing that's, I think, a positive trend is that more and more businesses, more and more employers are recognizing that the college degree is not very useful,
Mm.
that
Mm.
they're better off hiring somebody without a degree for lower pay during those, because they're younger, uh, who will earn up and learn on the job and aren't expecting a high income right from the beginning, but are eager to learn, that they are better off hiring people whose heart is in that business than hiring a college graduate.
Mm,
We hear
mm,
more and more of that. The number of registered apprenticeships in the Department of Labor has increased greatly over the last few years. And so the belief that you've got to go to college in order to be successful is gradually diminishing. We're already seeing a decline in the proportion of men who are going to college. I
right,
think there's more
right.
than one reason for that. We haven't seen that same decline with women. The result is that something like three-fifths or even higher of all college applicants are now women. Part of the reason is that we've changed schooling in such a way that it is damaging boys more than it is girls for whatever,
Mm,
for reasons that would be a whole different discussion.
right,
But the other reason that I'm convinced of is that, at least at present, most of the ways of making a good living that involve a lot of intelligence and involve a lot of creativity are male stereotype jobs.
mm, mm,
The
mm,
electrician, plumber, construction industry, those kinds of things. Women are wising up to this, and more of them are going into these careers. And it's also the case that other kinds of careers, the kinds of careers that used to be called pink collar careers and so on, they're also less and less inclined to be requiring a college degree. And I think
mhm,
that will catch up. There are more and more apprenticeships for all kinds of things, such as being an administrative assistant in a business or in an office. There's more and more willingness to train you to do that. Being working in a bank, all kinds of things like that are happening. And so the belief that you've got to go to high school, get high grades, do all the appropriate things so you can get into a good college in order to get a good job. I think that is on the decline. And that will ease parents' fears
right.
about getting their kids into a good college, which will ease the pressure on kids, which is part of the problem with their mental health, the pressure on kids to basically create an outstanding college resume beginning when they're 5 years old.
Right, 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 right. So looking ahead on the dark side of your crystal ball, is there anything in the trends that you see that worries you or makes you feel like the changes that you see are as positive might get short-circuited, barriered off, or worse things might happen? Anything bad lurking out there?
There are very, very serious problems in this world that we can't be optimistic about. We've got to confront them. We've got to face them. We all have to do this. We can't any longer say, I'm avoiding politics. The politics is ruining us right now. We were on a trend to try to deal with global warming. This has all been destroyed. And so that's the source of my real pessimism. But I think in terms of education, I think the concern is that the school system has so far, the officials within the school system have so far not recognized the problem. Some
Hmm.
individuals within it have recognized the problem, but the school system keeps going in the wrong direction. More courses, more restrictions. I mean, here we are. Think about this. Here we are in a whole new world with computers, with
With
AI,
AI,
with
yep.
all that. And so, what's the school system response to it? Ban it. That's crazy. These are whole new, extraordinarily valuable educational tools. The school system refuses to adapt. It just wants to stick to the old ways and sees everything new as harmful instead of saying, hey, here's new opportunities. Here's new ways that we can teach. Here's new ways that children can learn. And this requires changing how we're doing things. They don't change how they're doing things. If
Hmm.
they change in the wrong direction. They
Mm.
they put more emphasis on the boring courses that the few people enjoy, and take away the enjoyable courses because they want the scores on these academic tests to go up because so that we're not so far behind. And then they're And then, I mean, here's the amazing thing. Common Core was designed to increase scores on reading and math. Ever since Common Core, scores on reading and math have gone down.
Mm,
They were
mm,
going up
mm,
before Common Core.
mm,
Ever since Common Core, they've been going down, despite the fact that greatly more hours are spent on training students. And nobody seems to understand that they've gone down because of those changes.
mhm,
That
mhm,
you, when you're drilling students for these tests, that's the most boring thing they could be. You're teaching them to be uninterested in reading. You're taking away the joy of reading. It used to be that you might ask kids to read a book of their choice and write a book report. They're no longer assigning that because that seems like a waste of time to them. They want to be training you to answer multiple choice questions about written passages, and nothing could be more boring than that. And so, of course, students are losing their interest in reading when you change the curriculum that way. But everybody wants to attribute it to something else. so,
mhm, mhm,
this is discouraging. There's very little evidence that the education bureaucracy is understanding what's happening and willing to take into account what's happening.
mm,
They're still talking about academic training in preschool, which is disastrous. Every study of it shows it's disastrous. It increases the rates of dyslexia, it increases the rates of ADHD, it decreases the reading scores several years later. Just to take little kids and make them sit and do worksheets, it's cruel, but they're moving more and more in that direction. So this is a
mm,
terrible, terrible trend that's going on.
mm. So in some ways, it's like the worst case scenario is that the system proves even more resilient than it's shown itself to be so far.
Yeah, but I do think on the other hand, the more they go in this direction, the more people are taking their kids out. And so
Right.
because they can see that their children are suffering.